Right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. My name is Kyle Hartung. I'm an Associate Vice President here at Jobs for the Future and our education practice with my colleague Charlotte Cahill, co-lead our National Pathways to Prosperity work. And thanks so much for joining us today for one of our coalition webinars. This one taking us way back to a little bit of the origin story of this work, broadly framed Pathways to Prosperity 101. So a little bit today about the data and the stories that undergird where we've been and set a little bit of a trajectory about where we are heading. Our time is going to go quickly, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. If I can, there we go. For those of you who are a little bit newer to this conversation, just wanted to say a little bit about Jobs for the Future. So we are a national nonprofit organization. For over 40 years, we've been focused on driving transformation of the US education and workforce systems to achieve equitable economic advancement for all. And to do that, we're partnering with education and workforce leaders, business and industry leaders across the country, like yourselves, to design solutions and scale best practices, advocate for the policies and practices that we know work, invest time and energy and resources into the development of new solutions, all in the service of improving the lived experience of youth and young adults, and ultimately the communities and economies in which they live. A core part of that work for us has been this Pathways to Prosperity initiative, which has always been a place-based design, really focusing on scaling equitable, centering equity in the scaling of education and career pathways systems. And so for over 12 years now, we have been at the center of the conversation of the Pathways movement, really thinking about how do we reimagine and restructure the ways our systems are aligned to better prepare young people for careers. A couple years back now, we're in our second year, we launched what we call the Pathways to Prosperity Coalition. And this was an effort to really bring more voices to the table to make sure that folks had an opportunity to see and be seen, to listen and to be heard in a national conversation about what we might do today as we bring forward the best practices that we know work, but also reimagine what's possible for tomorrow so that opportunity is distributed equitably and that we're not leaving up to chance or zip code regarding who has access to what, when, and how they might attain that. Here's a quick map, just giving you a sense of the breadth and reach and depth of this coalition, working with partners across the country. Some of you on this call have been a part of our Pathways to Prosperity network in the past. Some of you have been a part of our coalition-based activities, so these larger bodies of work that have scaled best practices across the country over time. I'm really proud to have all of you here today and to represent the good work and thinking of folks from across the country. So back in 2011, the Harvard Graduate School of Education published this report, Pathways to Prosperity Report, which was really calling into question the four-year college for all mantra that had guided educational reform for decades, taking a hard look at the data and suggesting that there was a different focal point that we needed, really trying to operationalize the and in college and career pathways, and really thinking differently about how do we better pair and partner education, high school education, post-secondary education, and the labor market in a really concerted effort to challenge the status quo, but also drive toward different outcomes. And there's a lot of data that suggests that this is really important work then and even more important today.
So now that Kyle's provided a little bit of the origin story of all of this, and hi, I'm Charlotte. I do exactly what Kyle said I do. Wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the data that has informed our work over the years, and where we think it's pointing us. So really, as we sort of like look at this first slide, right? And look at changes in high school graduation rates from right around when the Pathways to Prosperity work launched in 2012 to the kind of most recent available data. We've seen improvements in high school graduation rates. So congratulations to all who were engaged in making that happen. And I think importantly, although there's still definitely equity gaps as you look across the disaggregated data, it is also true that high school graduation rates have improved across the board for everyone. So everybody is better off than they were in 2012 in terms of high school graduation. But on the next slide, if we start to look at what's happening at the college level, the story over the last decade or so is not looking quite so good. So we actually know that college enrollment rates have been declining. There is, I'll add some new data not accounted for on this slide that suggests a small uptick just this year in college enrollments, but overall, college enrollments of 18 to 24-year-olds have been on a downswing. And the graduation rate at public 2- and 4-year institutions has largely stalled out. And again, both of these kind of post-secondary data points hold true even as we're looking at disaggregated data. It's a fairly consistent story, although there are equity gaps within it still. So on the next slide, right, so we've got improving high school graduation. Post-secondary isn't so great if we're thinking about 2- and 4-year institutions. And we know that many of us have really been thinking about how can we start embedding opportunities to earn industry recognized credentials in high school so that students are earning those before they graduate from high school. But a challenge is that most students are not earning the right credentials, even as we've increased the number of credentials that students are earning. So a mere 19% of all credentials that high school students in the US earn are actually in demand. And this is in some ways the same side of the same coin, or the other side of the same coin, but worth thinking about in its own right. Employers, right, are really asking for a small subset of all of the credentials that are out there that high school students are earning, right? So 2/3 of employer requests for credentials, meaning things that are showing up in job ads, are for only 50 credentials. So I think that's really important for us to consider too, as we're thinking about, right, where are pathways leading young people, and how are we making sure that they're really leading to improved outcomes. Next slide, please. Another kind of key piece of data that we spend a lot of time thinking about is that employers are asking for a fairly limited number of credentials. There is much broader agreement among employers about the need for employability skills, durable skills, soft skills, whatever you call them, where you are. Right, so we're talking about things like critical thinking, communication, teamwork, leadership, all flagged repeatedly by employers as critical and as skills that college graduates that they see are lacking in pretty significant ways. So again, sort of something for us to consider in the design of pathways. Next slide, please. And as we're sort of adding all of this up and thinking back to some of that post-secondary completion data, we also have been looking pretty hard at data, particularly from the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, showing their projections for jobs. It will not be a surprise, probably, to anyone who's joined us today, that an increasing number of jobs, and by far the majority of jobs in the US, do and will require post-secondary education. But I think it's worth also starting to think about what we mean by post-secondary education and what kinds of jobs are aligned to that. So we know that about 40% of all jobs will require bachelor's degrees, and critically, right, 3/4 of those will be good jobs. There are also sort of projections show going to be plenty of jobs available that are middle skill jobs that require high school diplomas, but with increasingly few of those jobs really being good jobs as we would think about them. Next slide. And so if we look at where we are right now with all of that in mind, we know that only 49% of all young workers, so fewer than half, currently have good jobs. And if we look at the disaggregated data, not only are there kind of racial disparities, but young women in every racial and ethnic group are less likely than men to have good jobs. Next slide. And again, most of those good jobs are going to those with bachelor's degrees. But what I really want to focus on this slide is what it shows about sort of the historical trends here. So if you look at kind of that middle grouping on the graph on the slide, what you see is that the number of jobs that require sub-baccalaureate degrees and credentials has remained pretty steady, right? So if you look, the yellow is where we were in 1980, the green is projections for 2031. We're not seeing big shifts in this category overall. Where we're seeing a really big change is in the number of workers in good jobs who had only a high school diploma in 1980, right? Projections show that that's going to like shift all the way over so that the vast majority of workers with good jobs in 2031 will have bachelor's degrees. So want to like be really conscious as we're thinking about all the different options for pathways to really think about what the implications of some of this data are for our work. Next slide, please. And we know that this is really important even beyond thinking about pathway structures and our education and workforce development systems, because we see as we start to look at those careers, which are where we're hoping to support young people in getting to, that, right, there is pretty dramatic occupational segregation in the US, and that we see sort of clustered in the highest paying occupations, they are dominated by white men, right, at kind of whatever level you're looking at. Whereas in the lowest paying occupations, there are many more men and women of color. In a sort of disproportionate way as we consider sort of figures for the US population as a whole. And so part of what we would really, suggest needs to be happening as we're thinking about pathways design is figuring out what our role can be in disrupting these patterns of occupational segregation that we see, and as we think about where pathways are leading young people. Next slide. And relatedly, on the subject of where pathways may be leading young people, we know that wealth inequality is a major problem. So this goes beyond jobs and earnings to really think about, right, what does household wealth look like? And something to flag here, if you look at this, clearly really major and troubling racial and ethnic disparities in median household wealth. But the other thing to flag is the consistency like within racial and ethnic groups of, right, the disparity between household wealth for households where the highest degree held is a bachelor's degree versus households where the highest degree held is an associate's degree or a high school diploma. And sort of the high school diploma and associate's degree are much closer together. And bachelor's degree holding households in every racial and ethnic group have twice or more household wealth as associate's degree holders. Next slide, please. So as we're thinking about all of this, right, we've talked a lot about college and career and all of those things that folks in the Pathways movement are rightfully really focused on and that we are really focused on in our Pathways to Prosperity work. But we also think it's really important to pay attention to what young people themselves are talking about and thinking about as they consider their futures. And, research has shown that what they're thinking about is not kind of what job do I want to have? What level of education do I want to achieve? It's instead a related, but I think significantly different question about what do I want my life to be like in the future? And yes, young people understand that college and career and education are all part of what they want their life to be like in the future. But that's not the only thing as they think about their aspirations to live good lives, to try on different kinds of futures, to think about sort of how they distinguish between the ideas of surviving and striving and thriving as different ways that they could envision what their life would be like in the future. So wanting to also, even as we dig into all of this data on college and careers, really make sure that we are taking into account how we understand that in relation to how young people are thinking about their futures. Kyle, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, just for a second, thanks, Charlotte. And if it's not clear, like this is the kind of data and the kind of stories that are keeping us up at night as we think about how ill-equipped our systems really are to address these realities. And so whether we're looking at inequities in outcomes and attainment, whether we're looking at inequitable opportunity in the labor market, whether we're actually thinking about whether or not schools and our education systems are equipped to meet young people where they are. And I think that the current youth, young generation that these data are drawn from, they have language to talk about what they need that is really unique as I think about my own career in the education space. And they're articulating things that are very sharp and very targeted. And our systems ultimately are designed to be way too linear. They're force fitting far too many young people into a system that was never designed to accommodate the type of flexibility, the type of focus on identity and assets that young people are demanding, and that the data suggests that we need to really focus on as we think about moving young people from education and into career. And so we really need to take a step back, and our work has historically and currently still focuses on not just the repair of what has not worked, but really reimagining these systems from the ground up so that they are not impossible to navigate, that they are not a black box for youth and families to figure out, how do I move from where I am to where I am not? And so our work is born out of sort of these four core big ideas as we think about serving the needs of all young people, right? So how do we make sure that young people are starting college and high school with strategic early college course taking that is aligned to post-secondary credentials with value in the labor market, that is aligned to access to career advancement and good jobs over time, and that ultimately creates a system where there are really no dead ends. And I think the field has inadvertently stalled on thinking about what a no dead ends approach really looks like. So this is not our conversation about the primacy of the BA as we think about economic outcomes and good jobs is not about returning to a college for all approach, but it is making sure that we can make the promise of a no dead ends or no wrong doors strategy a reality. And that requires a whole systems level reconfiguration of how everything is designed from the ground up. This work then is also not just about the needs of young people and what we aspire to be true in terms of the transformative types of outcomes we seek for young people and young adults, but also thinking about the real and experienced and lived needs of employers, thinking about the needs of communities and ultimately of economies. This is where people live and work and raise families and contribute. And so how do we bring together a vision around career and connection so that contribution becomes a reality and not just an aspiration for young adults as they move into their adulthood? To do that, we need all sorts of people at the table. And so this is not just a question or a concern in our work that is about the education side of the house. This is not just about the design and implementation of new programs, but really thinking about systems level strategies that center economic and equitable economic advancement at the heart of this. And so really looking around the outer edge of this, we think about how do we bring together not just K-12 and post-secondary institutions, but how do we make sure that community-based organizations are at the table for the design of these systems? The voices and needs of business and industry are at the table from the design standpoint, rather than just on the other side being asked to contribute and participate. The role and function of intermediary organizations, bringing together national partners and networks who can bring the best of what they know how to do, and being able to connect practitioners and leaders and policymakers together to have real conversations about what transformation will look like, and ultimately thinking through the policy realm and how do we make sure that we're not just focusing on top down, but also sort of bottom up and grassroots level activism and thinking about elevating practices that really work and are creating strong proof points in the field. Charlotte, anything you want to add on this before we move on?
Carry on.
Carry on. So when we launched Pathways to Prosperity, this work was born on a framework, right? We have never suggested that this work was a model. There's not a prescribed approach. Context matter and people matter, and local policy and community environments matter. And so how do we think about a framework and a set of strategies that can be deployed across contexts, but ultimately customized? And as we think about these 5 core levers in this framework, the role of intermediary organizations, so those that are working at the intersection of education and workforce and policy, really thinking about who is the glue of these pathway systems and the role that they can play in elevating the right needs at the right time. Obviously, the work and role of leadership and policy, and that's both big P and little p policy. Focusing on the integration of secondary and post-secondary education rather than the siloing of those parts of our education system. Really thinking differently about not just career advising, but the career navigation systems that are in place that help the meaning making that young people need to do as they make decisions about their potential best possible futures as they move through education and into work. And then the fundamental integration of real work-based learning as a core component of everyone's educational journey from the classroom into the workplace. Charlotte, you want to talk a little bit about secondary, post-secondary integration?
Sure. So, Kyle sort of offered a preview of each of these levers, but wanted to provide a little bit more of a deep dive for you all on what we mean by this. And I can say we went through a little bit of a process of overhauling these levers a few years ago. And I say that because, right, they've been around for as long as Pathways to Prosperity has been around, or we've had 5 levers, and a couple of years ago, we were like, so we've learned some things. Maybe we need to figure out our levers. And on this one, something that we had a pretty deliberate conversation about was, were we going to call this secondary, post-secondary integration, or were we only going to try for alignment? And we decided that we want to push for integration, knowing that that is a challenge. But how do, but we like a good challenge. And what we really want to aim for here is thinking about how we can erase boundaries across K-12 and post-secondary institutions and systems. As we're thinking about bringing all those stakeholders together on the slide Kyle was talking about, we know, I think we all recognize there can be what feels like a big gap sometimes between education and industry, but even within education, right, we see differences between K-12 and post-secondary. How can we really start to erase those boundaries, build out sequences of courses that are bridging, right, and further integrating K-12 and post-secondary? And this is really critical to the point Kyle was making about pathways with no dead ends, that bring together both rigorous core academics and career-focused learning. So this isn't about one or the other. It's certainly not about college or career. It's about how are we preparing young people for their futures and all of the permutations of things that they might do in their futures. And really critical to our work and strategies is dual enrollment. So providing those early college course taking opportunities that Kyle was mentioning, and making sure that it's aligned to pathways as we think about what dual enrollment looks like. So no random acts of dual enrollment, but really intentional and strategic dual enrollment. No, carry on, next slide. And we get excited about dual enrollment because we know it works. I will also say, right, that if anybody on your team on our team tells you that we know exactly what we're doing with all the things about pathways, that is not true. We don't. This is hard work with lots of challenges, and we're still learning. But one thing that we know for sure, and that there is tons of peer-reviewed research to support, is that dual enrollment improves academic attainment and outcomes at both the high school and post-secondary levels. So if you sort of look at what's on the slide, I won't get into all of the detail, but you can see here, right, there are multiple really critical academic indicators in here that we know are strengthened by participation in dual enrollment. Next slide. So as we come to this sort of, again, this idea of career navigation systems, really with an emphasis, as in all of our work, on systems building. So this isn't just about advising. It's not just about, let's give young people some information and make sure, and then they should figure out what to do with it. It's how do we really shift the burden of figuring this out from young people to systems with intentional structures to support navigation. And right, thinking about things that are a little bit more intangible. So this isn't just about course sequencing. It's not only about understanding labor markets, although that is all absolutely part of it, but it's about helping young people understand, right, how do I build and navigate a career successfully? How should I be thinking about building a professional network? What does it mean to talk about social capital? What happens if I encounter implicit bias in the labor market? So how do we start to build out systems that really support young people in navigating all aspects of their careers, and not just in thinking about it when they're in high school, but really over a lifetime, thinking about all of that. And we know that that's really important if you go to the next slide. Because we know that careers don't look the same as they used to. And I'm going to let Kyle talk about this because he thinks this is exciting and I think it's a little stressful. We can say more about why, but I'll let you hear the excitement first.
Thank you, Charlotte. I do love this slide so much. But to build on what Charlotte was saying, right, is so the traditional career arc, like, it was very much based in an old economic structure that wasn't working well for a majority of Americans either, but followed this very natural arc of you go to school and then you get a job, maybe you get higher education, maybe you don't, and then you work somewhere and then you retire and you ride off into the sunset if you're lucky, happy. But the reality for quite some time has been that work and learning are constantly evolving for people at the individual, but also in the economy itself. And this goes back to the point we were making earlier about our systems are not designed to account for this bottom image here, right? Our systems are still predicated on people following this very unnatural upside down bell curve arc of moving through life. But it's not designed to really meet the reality of this frenetic, constantly evolving, reactive world that people are living in, and that frankly that they're sometimes very excited to live in. And how do we then create a system that honors and respects that? Well, yeah, young people actually change their minds over time. But our systems do not like that very much. They like for a young person to decide what they want to be when they grow up and then track them into that sequence and then carry them off, as opposed to designing a system that is really responsive to the needs and the evolution of adolescence, and then ultimately the evolution of the economy so that people always have access to new learning and new opportunities for growth and advancement over time. Charlotte, what about this really stresses you out?
I mean, some people don't want to just sort of move back and forth all the time. I personally have had my job for 10 years. And I think, right. So I think that it's both the reality and I think, right, as we're talking about this no dead ends approach to pathways, part of what we're trying to do is help people, is to create systems where people feel prepared to make these transitions over a lifetime, to Kyle's point, in a way that feels more seamless than not. I think Kyle used the word frenetic at one point, and I was like, yeah, that's exactly what stresses me out. And so right? So how can we think about recognizing this reality? Also, um, think about how to really support people in navigating it effectively.
And before I go on, the one last point I want to circle back to there that Oh, that's not the right direction. I'm sorry. Oh boy.
Nope, you're really off
Is
now.
I apologies. Um, is when we think about the idea of a system for navigation, and Charlotte used the term, which I really love, like it's shifting the burdens of the from the individual and leaving it up to chance that they know what to do and what to look at. Is it's really a full reimagining of the adults in that system and the type of access that young people and families have to a variety of adults who are able to inform these decisions. And so, how do we make sure that they're connected with folks who not just understand the post-secondary education and training landscape, but have a sense of the labor market, have a sense of adolescent development and the way that people evolve over time so that we can really meet young people where they are. I wouldn't deign to talk about work-based learning with Charlotte in the room. And so I'm just going to be quiet for a minute.
I feel a little surprised by this turn of events, just to name, because Kyle knows me well enough to know also that I could use up the rest of our time talking about work-based learning. But and I'll just say by way of introduction to that, that you know the reason I get so excited about work-based learning is it's partly because it's really hard to figure out how to do and how to scale. And I like things that are hard, but the more important reason that I get really excited about work-based learning is that it really has so much potential to be a critical lever for equity in our pathways work, if we can really get it right. So with that as kind of context, I will also say, transitioning into kind of how we define work-based learning, that I'll just go ahead and use the word, rather dogmatic about the definition of work-based learning. And it's because, I think we have to do work-based learning with quality in order to get all of the benefits from it that I really think it has the potential to provide. So we define work-based learning at JFF as a student or worker completing meaningful job tasks in a workplace. And that in a workplace piece of this is really critical because what we're really hoping to do through work-based learning is not just, support young people in developing technical skills or employability skills or learning about the world of work, although all of those are really important elements of work-based learning. We're also hoping to support young people in really building their professional networks and professional social capital, for which it is critical to start supporting them in building connections with professionals in fields that they're interested in. So we see that piece about working directly with professionals in workplaces as a really important part of all of this, to really support a continuum of lifelong learning and skill development as we think about work-based learning. Next slide. And so on that kind of continuum point, we don't exactly have a work-based learning continuum. I know that is the sort of popular framing of all the different types of work-based learning, is that it's a continuum. We have a framework with arrows that go every which way. And we don't do that just to be confusing, but we do it because we really think of work-based learning as iterative, right? So as students participate in sort of shorter term, less intensive forms of work-based learning, like job shadowing, or company tours, right? And sort of move through like apprenticeships or internships and then on to apprenticeships, like that is certainly like a progression that may make sense for a lot of people. But it may also be that, someone will complete an internship and think, I really hated that. And if that is the case, they should probably not go on and try out an apprenticeship in the same field. They should maybe sort of go back and do some job shadowing in some other fields and see how that works out. So that's, sort of as we think about it, why there are all these little arrows here trying to signal some of that. And also just to flag this career exploration box over here on the left, is really about, again, how we think about preparing young people for work-based learning. So, like I said, I'm dogmatic about the definition of work-based learning. I don't think that it's the only thing that matters by any stretch of the imagination. So we see career exploration activities like career fairs, like doing industry projects, project-based learning, as really critical ways to start to prepare young people to participate in these work-based learning models that you see over on the right-hand side.
But before I move on, I just want to say one more thing on this point is one of the reasons that presenting a framework has been important for us has been to help folks reimagine how we use those continua, which are very prominent. They're very helpful. Like they articulate a number of activities and how you can sequence them. But to over-index on the continuum sort of results in an too linear of an experience for young people. And so how do we use a framework like this? Also, if we want to push on the secondary, post-secondary integration component, is how do we stretch the work-based learning experience and meaning making across secondary and post-secondary, as opposed to something that happens in isolation and disconnected between K-12 and post-secondary. We know a great deal about why work-based learning matters. The short story here, right, is a very strong ROI for employers and a really strong ROI for learners and workers themselves. We see huge conversion rates of people who participate in work-based learning into full-time employment. And these numbers are durable over time, and they're true at younger ages as well as older ages. We should probably do a whole other webinar on sort of the data around work-based learning. But big story here and is there's value embedded in this from both the employer and the economic perspective in investing early in young people. And then obviously the developmental aspects for young people are really paramount. Which brings us to one of our other levers around intermediaries and intermediary functions. And so these systems are complicated to stand up. They're complicated to scale. And they really require organizations and entities and sometimes functions stretched across organizations that are really thinking about the unique needs of any given community or ecosystem in which they're operating. I think I used this term before. They serve really as the glue of a pathway system. And that doesn't mean that their work resides at the center of that system, but their coordinating function really can and should. It's a lot of work to partner with employers in education to get work-based learning standing up. It's a lot of work to advocate for policies at the state level that will impact students' lived experience at the local level. And so how do we develop and scale the role of intermediaries and functions to take on the burden of those responsibilities so that each of the other actors in the system can bring forward the best piece of their component part of the student experience over time? How do they function as connectors and coordinate systemic level action? How do they, so we used to use the term neutral conveners. And I think that that's a little bit of a dicey term, right? We actually don't want intermediaries to be neutral. We want them to have a point of view. But the spirit of the idea of neutrality is someone who can be trusted to hold the best interests of students, employers, community, and the economy at the center of the conversation so that everyone can be partnering really effectively. And then ultimately, one of the key functions that intermediaries often serve in these systems is supporting the facilitation of work-based learning. Otherwise, employers just feel nibbled to death by goldfish with random outreach from well-meaning and well-intentioned high school educators or counselors, for instance, looking for opportunities for their young people. But to centralize those functions and systematize them is also one of the ways of entering the conversation about equity into that system so that it's not a question or a conversation about who has access to these opportunities or not, but really creating an equitable set of conditions for that. One of the ways that we think about the power of intermediaries and their work is really transitioning from thinking about regional or local implementation of pathways to a regional pathways ecosystem. And so part of the work of an intermediary is really to transition things from the left side of this chart over to the right. And so really thinking about how do we make sure that everyone has access to all of the benefits of this rather than one-off programs that are based on relationships or a strong leader in place X or place Y. Charlotte?
Um, So I think the other thing just to say as we're sort of thinking about this framework and these levers, right? We sort of think about secondary, post-secondary integration, career navigation systems, and work-based learning as core elements, like design elements of pathways themselves. And then infrastructure is also really important to supporting pathways. So intermediaries and those regional ecosystems that Kyle was just talking about are critical elements of the infrastructure that we need. And so is strong cross-sector leadership and enabling policy conditions, right? So we really think about this. And again, we think about policy at lots of different levels. But that includes, right, the sort of capital P policy. So how are folks at the federal and state levels working to remove policy barriers? And how can folks at an institutional level also think about, are there institutional policies that are getting in the way of supporting pathways development? How can we come together across all of those stakeholder groups to communicate a clear vision for this work? And then start to think about how can we work collaboratively to braid funding to support that work, to collect data to support our collective continuous improvement, and so that we all can kind of be on the same page moving forward. So all really key policy issues in this, and we know policy is really important. Next slide. Because it brings together kind of these core challenges in our pathways work. We know, right? We know there are so many and pathways out across the country that are terrific pathways. Many of you are very likely building those pathways, working on them, leading that work. And right, we know that scale and sustainability continue to be big challenges, especially as we think about equity in our pathways work. And we believe that policy and getting the right policy conditions in place can really help to support all of the terrific work that is already happening and make sure that we are serving more students and doing so in a really equitable way.
So on the far edge of this entire conversation is sort of a natural extension of what we've been up to with Pathways to Prosperity over the last 10 plus years. A few years back, we published a paper called The Big Blur. And this was a little bit born out of, let's call it impatience with the pace of change that we're seeing. And so earlier we talked a little bit about like, how do we both improve what's happening today and bring to bear best practices that we know and hope will make a difference in the lived experience of young people and young adults, while also reimagining tomorrow. So with the Big Blur, we took a step back and took a hard look at the pace of change, looking at all of these efforts that we've been involved in here, going way back to launching early college and the career pathways work, strategic dual enrollment, integrated work-based learning, but we're not seeing a change in those outcome data as we think about economic advancement or as we think about educational attainment. So the Big Blur was a little bit of a push to ask people to think differently about, well, what if we actually just created an entirely new model of education altogether that was not reimagining what happens in high school or reimagining what happens in college. But what if there was a new type of institution altogether, for instance, that served essentially grades 11 to 14 or youth ages 16 to 20, that was explicitly designed to focus on that level, that window of adolescent development, integrated work-based learning by design, free for all students, really leaning into a hard question about what is our public responsibility and commitment to supporting young people to attain post-secondary credentials and integrated work experience, given what we know about the longevity and the durability of those data over time. And so this is a big lift. And this was a little bit of a provocation, but we're seeing evidence in the field of people who have been doing this work. I encourage you to look at, for instance, what the Stern Collaboration Center in Colorado has been up to. And we're seeing evidence of other folks working on ideas that I think are really blurry. I think I see Eric Dunkers in the room here today. He's currently leading a body of work at the National Center for the Apprenticeship Degree, really trying to reimagine what the post-secondary edge of this looks like as we think about marrying apprenticeships with bachelor's degrees. But to really institute these types of transformative ideas that the Big Blur calls for. Encourage you to check it out if it's interesting. Is also a completely reimagined set of policies that we need to be in place as we think about how are people incentivized to work differently, thinking differently about braided and blended funding streams, thinking differently about the alignment infrastructure at the state level that allows this blur to occur between K-12 and post-secondary and career. Altogether new governance models that are looking at different types of leadership. So rather than separate leaders of different levels of agencies, what does it look like to have a unified governance model that is really responsible for young people in this age window? And really radical, what would it look like to have entirely new types of teaching, a teaching force that is trained specifically in both adolescent but also adult development, that is really well positioned to be career navigators and career advisors for young people in the classroom and in the workplace. Lots of good work happening in this space. Encourage you to check it out using our beloved QR codes. And I know we want to save a little bit of time here for questions, but wanted to say a little bit more on the back end of this. At the front, we introduced a little bit about the origin story about Pathways to Prosperity as a body of work at JFF itself. But we really think that the power of this work lies in, and what we now have is this Pathways to Prosperity Coalition, right? And so how do we make sure we're not leaving good ideas on the table? How do we pitch a really big tent? How do we collectively get curious about what might be possible rather than doubling down or leaning in on what we have learned or what has worked in the past, but keeping our eyes on that transformative piece of reimagining tomorrow. So really with the spirit of this coalition, webinars like this, like trying to bring as many people into this conversation with us as possible, to bring as many viewpoints as we can to the table. And frankly, just to get really curious together. We don't have all the answers. I don't think any of us individually do, but we think that there's a lot of power in people coming together in formal and informal ways to have these conversations. So at JFF, we engage folks on a number of ways. We have folks, some of whom are in the room, who are currently or historically been in what we call our Pathways to Prosperity network. And so this is a network model, a membership model where people are partnered with us over time to build and reimagine their pathway systems. Our work on that side is not just as a convener, but also providing customized and context-specific technical assistance as we think about the unique needs of any given state or region or labor market. But that also this engagement is occurring through this broad coalition of partnerships that we're proud to be a part of, a number of national initiatives and projects across the country. So what do network members do in the Pathways to Prosperity Network? Well, there's lots of opportunities to learn and collaborate. They have access to a breadth of expertise from across JFF and our partners in the field. But ultimately, it's about these customized supports that we are able to bring to bear to support the unique work and needs that you have in your context as we think about the strategies that you need in place and how might we facilitate and provide the types of analyses that will help you make the right decisions in the right moments of time about the next stages in your system development, support in the back end as you think about policy and advocacy, and also how do we communicate and convey the stories that need to be told so that young people and families know what is available and what possibilities really exist for them. And then as we think about the coalition itself, these are some of the many ways that we engage coalition members. We've opened up our national institutes to include folks from beyond our Pathways to Prosperity network, which I think has really enriched a national conversation. And on the next slide, you'll see access if you want to learn a little bit more about that event coming up in October and get plugged into our newsletters. We have a book club coming up and happy to talk a little bit more about all those before we take a little bit of a break for some Q&A. Why don't we do that now before we do that closing slide? Charlotte, anything else you want to say before we open the floodgates?
Happy to entertain any and all questions, comments, complaints. What do you all have?